So in part two of this lesson on civilizations as a unit of historical analysis, we're going to consider how many of these units there are and what are they. And we can start with this diagram of Eurasia, showing it divided into 5 major civilizations. So we have the West, the Slav civilizations, so basically Russia, Persia, China, and then India. Now, we said before that when there's a change in superstyle, that represents a change in civilization. And there have been changes in superstyle in these different areas. So there are more civilizations than are shown in this snapshot. And also, of course, there are the other continents, the Americas and Africa. So that's going to add to our count of civilizations through history. And what I'm going to do now is talk through 5 key civilization theorists and their ideas about what these civilizational units are. So we'll start with Nikolai Danilevsky, who's a Russian of the late 19th century. And he wrote a book, Russia and Europe, in which he said there have been 12 civilizations through history, and those would be, the usual ones we might imagine, the Egyptian, the Chinese, the Western, plus one that's coming into existence. And that is the Russian civilization. So what he was trying to argue was that Russia is not a kind of poor relation of European civilization and sort of lagging behind the rest of its civilization. It's actually not part of European civilization at all. It is a new civilization that's coming into being. So in the course of developing that argument, he identified these civilizations through history. And so he became kind of the first civilization theorist thinking about history in terms of the life cycle of civilizations. Okay, and our next theorist is Oswald Spengler, writing in the early 20th century. So he was somewhat inspired by Danilevsky's ideas about civilizations. And although he's not that explicit about his count of civilizations, what emerges from his book is basically 8 civilizations. So these are the Babylonian civilization and the Egyptian civilizations, so the ancient civilizations of Egypt and the Middle East, China and India, then the classical civilization of Greece and Rome, and what he called sometimes the Arabian civilization, but also the Magian civilization. He called it after the Magi, who came to the birth of Jesus. The Magi were, thinkers of the ancient Near East. So this is a civilization of, what's today, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and into Iraq, the Middle East. And then the Mexican civilization of the Americas and the Western civilization. And for Spengler, all civilizations have a finite lifespan of about 1,000 years. So we can see that all of these measure up to about 1,000 years in duration. And nevertheless, Spengler also recognized that, or in his theory, that a civilization could complete its life cycle, at which point it's lost the potential for further evolution, further contribution to history, but it can nevertheless continue in existence in a kind of ossified form. And so that's what he saw was the case for the Chinese, the Indian, and the Magian civilization. And so I've shown those as being, the red colour shows that they still exist, blue shows they're defunct. So they still exist, but only in this, static, stagnant, ossified form, with no further potential for development. And Western civilization, he believed, would be coming to its end in the next century or so at the time that he was writing on that basis. And so he hasn't got a separate Islamic civilization. He recognized the Islamic civilization, or the arrival of Islam, as a kind of reform movement within his Magian civilization, similar to the Reformation that occurred in Western civilization. So he saw it as, you know, occurring at the same stage within the civilizational life cycle, and he identified reform movements in these other civilizations as well. Another point we should mention about Spengler as well is that he saw each civilization as completely self-contained. It comes into existence, lives its life cycle and disappears. It doesn't depend on anything else. And this was a key point for him, because he wanted to emphasize that the Western civilization is not like the inheritor of classical civilization. It thinks it is. It, you know, it's often argued that the classical became the Western, but he says no, the Western civilization is a completely different thing. The classical civilization came and went, it had its life cycle, and then the Western civilization came into existence and had its life cycle. But he did recognize that a new civilization can kind of recycle ideas from older ones, but it always does something different with them. So it's not really, it presents itself as the inheritor of earlier ideas, but actually it's really remodeling what it takes from those previous civilizations. We'll come on to Spengler's theory in more detail in the next lesson. Okay, and our next theorist is Arnold Toynbee, whose theory of civilizations is set out in his book, A Study of History. And he originally published it in this huge 12-volume work, and in that he identified 21 proper civilizations and 8 what he called abortive civilizations. So 21 proper and 8 abortive. And the abortive civilizations sort of got started but were then absorbed into one of his proper civilizations. And then he brought out a 1-volume edition of the Study of History, where he had another go at identifying civilizations. And in this case, he found that there were 14 now that he considered proper full civilizations, 17 that he called satellites or arrested civilizations that never completed their life cycle and were associated with some of the proper civilizations, so they didn't go through the same life cycle of a proper civilization. And then there were 6 now abortive. So you know, that adds up to 29, and now in his 1-volume edition he now counted 37 civilizations. And one of his innovations was to suggest that these civilizations sort of formed a family tree. So where Spengler insisted that each one is a thing in its own right, he said no, civilizations inherit from each other. So I'll draw up a little bit of his family tree to illustrate that. Okay, so just to illustrate the point, here's part of Toynbee's family tree of civilizations. So we can start up the top here with the Sumero-Akkadian, the ancient civilization of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and civilizations flow down from there. The ones that are shaded in fully are the proper civilizations. Those with an X in are the satellite or arrested civilizations, and then the blanks are abortive, and then a double circle shows the ones that are still in existence. So from the Sumero-Akkadian we go down, which was a proper civilization, we go down to the Hittite civilization, which was a satellite civilization. Then this, what he calls the Syriac civilization, so that's the same sort of area of the ancient Near East, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, over to Iraq. And then from that, Christianity came out of that. So the Christian Orthodox civilization of the Byzantine Empire of Constantinople, which no longer exists. It came to an end when the Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453. But out of that comes the Russian civilization of today, which he saw as a satellite civilization. And then over here, the West inherited Christianity from the Syriac civilization, but he also sees it as deriving somewhat from the medieval city-state civilization, which was an abortive civilization. It started, but it got absorbed into Western civilization. So this is, of places like Florence and Venice, the city-states. And then we have the Islamic civilization, which he derives from a couple of earlier civilizations, which I haven't shown. One is the Nestorian Christian civilization of the Middle East, so that goes into the Islamic civilization. And then the Egyptian civilization, which is another proper civilization but defunct. And he saw the African civilization as deriving from these. So it's a mixture of, the Western influences, Islamic influences, and ancient Egyptian influences. And all his civilizations he's got connected in this family tree. So this is just a sample of it, but to illustrate the idea that this was his innovation to suggest how civilizations were related to each other in this way, contra what Spengler had said. And because civilizations can come into existence and disappear, there's a kind of turnover of civilizations. And I'll now draw a little chart to illustrate that. So this shows Toynbee's idea about the creation and destruction of civilizations. Should add that these are BC up to here, and then this is AD. So that's the 4th millennium BC, 3rd millennium, 2nd millennium, and so on up to the 2nd millennium AD. 1000 to 2000. So according to Toynbee, there was a net creation of 2 civilizations in the 4th millennium BC. So we're looking at the ancient Egyptian and the Sumero-Akkadian civilizations. Then there was 3 civilizations net added in the 3rd millennium, 2nd millennium, and 1st millennium each. So it's a sort of steady creation of civilizations. And then there were 7 civilizations created in the 1st millennium AD. So that was a very good millennium for civilizations. And then, though, in the 2nd millennium AD, there was a net loss of 2 civilizations. So through this time, the count of civilizations was steadily increasing, but in the 2nd millennium, after 1000, it net decreased. And we can associate that to some extent with the discovery of the Americas and the loss of the Aztec, Inca and Maya civilizations. So our next theorist is Carroll Quigley in the 60s and 70s in his book The Evolution of Civilizations. And his work was an attempt to re-examine Toynbee's work and sort of make it more scientific, a harder theory. And he identified 16 civilizations in total, of which only 2 were still existing, the Western and the Orthodox civilizations, so the European, Euro-American civilization and the Russian civilization. And in making Toynbee's theory more scientific, one of the things that he took over was the idea that each civilization develops in a universal state, as I mentioned in the last part of this lesson, or an empire that covers the whole civilization, and that a civilization is then weakened or destroyed by invasion, by what Toynbee calls the external proletariat, or in common speech, the barbarians who invade the civilization. So I'll just put up a little table here of some of Quigleys civilizations and the empires and their invaders, just to give the idea. Okay, so here's Quigley's ideas about some civilizations, what corresponded to their universal states or civilizations spanning empires, and who the invaders were that brought these civilizations to an end. This isn't exhaustive. I've got 7 here, but as I mentioned, he has 16 in total. But let's just go through to get a feel for it. So there's the Mesopotamian civilization of ancient Iraq. And he said that the empire that formed there was the Persian Empire, which was eventually invaded by the Greeks. So we're talking about Alexander the Great, who invaded the Persian Empire and brought it to an end. Then there's the Cretan civilization of the Aegean, the Mediterranean, and the empire that formed there was the Minoan Empire based on Crete, and that was brought to an end by the Dorians, who are believed to have been the ancestors of the Greeks, who came in and brought down the civilization of this region, and then later classical Greek civilization developed out of them, the Dorian invasion. And then there's the Sinic civilization of the Far East of China. Its universal empire, he said, was the Han Empire of China, which was from about 200 BC to AD 200. And that was brought down by the Huns, or invaded by the Huns. He calls them the Huns. More strictly, we might say the Xiongnu, who were traditionally identified with the Huns, but now, or in more recent times, that's been considered kind of controversial that these barbarian Xiongnu invading China aren't identified with the Huns, even though they the names seem similar. But I think very recently, more work using DNA has come out to suggest that maybe they were related in some way. So yes, with things like his Dorian invasion and the Huns, his ideas are a bit out of date now, from the 60s and 70s. And then there's the classical civilization and its universal state. Its empire was the Roman Empire, and that was invaded by the German barbarians. Then there's the Andean civilization, as he calls it, which had its universal state under the Inca, who lasted only a century or so, before the European invaders came along and brought that civilization to an end. And similarly, the Hindu civilization, he sees its universal state as being the Mughal Empire, and that too was brought down by European invaders. But you could sort of question that, because the Mughals themselves could be seen as invaders. They were Islamic rulers who came from Central Asia, but brought a religion that came from the Middle East. So they could be seen as invaders, really. So it starts to call into question whether these trying to fit history into this civilizational framework creates arguments about interpretation. And then lastly, here's the Western civilization, and as he was writing in the 60s and 70s, he wasn't sure that an empire existed, though people might say, oh well, that's the American empire. And then he also in the 60s and 70s wasn't aware of who might invade it. And our last civilization theorist is Nicholas Hagger, who's writing around the time of the millennium, that's the year 2000. And his list of civilizations is largely based on Toynbee. He identifies 22 civilizations, and one of the key things he does is to add a couple. It's sort of Toynbee plus an Israelite civilization he identifies, which Toynbee doesn't have, and an oceanic civilization. So for Hagger, he wants to have a civilization, and there's no part of the earth that doesn't have a civilization belong to some kind of civilization. So he's got an oceanic civilization. As we said, that if we think of civilizations as being city based and networks of cities, that doesn't really describe what we had in the Pacific Ocean. But if we interpret civilization more widely as what people do and their world view, then yes, we can identify an oceanic civilization, and that's what Hagger does. And he, in his book, he presents a table that really takes up the whole book, very systematically going through these civilizations and describing their properties, against a set of features that each civilization can have. And for Hagger, 14 of his 22 civilizations are still in existence. Okay, and now I've put up here a table of all the civilizations that these various theorists identify, and how many theorists identify each civilization. And there's a possible total of 6, because although we had 5 theorists, Toynbee had 2 different versions, as we saw: his 12-volume study of history with its 29 civilizations, and his later 1-volume study of history with 37 civilizations. So in the top tier, if you like, there's with 6, that means everybody identifies these civilizations: the Chinese, the Indian, the Arab stroke Islamic, the Egyptian, the classical and the Western. They might have used slightly different terms for them, but they're basically the same civilizations. So those everybody recognizes. Then next we come down to the Mesopotamian, the Syrian civilization, the Christian Orthodox civilization, and the Andean civilization of the Inca Empire. So pretty much everybody identifies those. And then we go down to Japanese, Iranian, Hittite, Aegean, that's the Minoan civilization that we've just seen, and the Mesoamerican, the Mayan civilization. And going further down, Central Asian civilization, an separate Irish civilization, the Scandinavian civilization, and the Mexican civilization, so the Aztecs there. Then less popular still, an Oceanian civilization, the Southeast Asian civilization, Tibetan, the Indus Valley, that's the ancient Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro civilization, and an African civilization. And then lastly, with just kind of 1 vote each, there's the Far Eastern Christians, the Korean civilization, the Meroitic, so that's Ethiopia as ancient civilization or historical civilization from about the time of Christ, the Monophysite civilization and the Nestorian Christian civilizations of the Middle East, the Ottoman civilization, the Southwestern civilization, and the Mississippian civilization. Those are civilizations of North America, pre-Columbian North America, and the Eskimo civilization. And one of the things we can see here is how this is very much influenced by the knowledge that people had at the time. So we've got, yes, 6 civilization theorists, but we start with Danilevsky in the late 19th century. Then we've got Spengler and Toynbee in the early to middle 20th century. Quigleys, in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of the archaeology hadn't been done on things like, for example, the Indus Valley civilization at the time that Danilevsky and Spengler were writing, for example, and similarly the American civilizations, the extent of those was not clear for some of these early civilization theorists. So although we've got this comparative table, if people started doing this today, it might well change which ones people identify. But there hasn't been a systematic attempt to take forward these civilization theories. So to some extent we're dealing with classifications, counts of civilizations that are really out of date and don't reflect current archaeology. Okay, now let's consider a couple of criticisms of this approach of dividing history into civilizational units. The first is that it's a Western biased view, a Eurocentric view of history. So, for example, one writer about civilization theories who's a Muslim writer about them has suggested that, or pointed out that, the Western civilization theorists have identified the Islamic civilization either as, in Spengler's case, just a reform movement within his broader Magian or Arabian civilization, or as derived from earlier civilizations, as Toynbee did in his family tree of civilizations. But to the Islamic world, Islam is something entirely new in history. It's a new revelation. It's not derived from some earlier civilization. It's not an adaptation of anything, and it's certainly not a reform movement, just relegated to just a reform movement within a wider civilization. It is a new civilization in its own right and a new truth for humanity. So they would dispute the way a Western theorist would see the role of Islam in history. And a second criticism is that it's sort of arbitrary and invented some of these civilizations to try and make it fit the model, try and make the history fit the model of civilization. So a particular example is with Spengler's Magian civilization and Toynbee's Syriac civilization, which are kind of similar. They're both covering that area of the Middle East. It's been pointed out that that area was actually a hotbed of many different societies and cultures, and to try and make sense of it within their model, Spengler and Toynbee kind of invented a civilization that nobody had really talked about before they brought it into their theory. So they're kind of retrofitting their theory onto the facts rather than deriving from the facts or recognizing a civilization, because there was in fact no recognizable superstyle within this area, like we can recognize the superstyle of Egyptian civilization or the superstyle of the Aztec civilization. This didn't really apply here. So, as I say, it's kind of made up to fit the theory. And the last issue I'd like to mention is the idea that maybe there are a lot more civilizations than we've been discussing in these counts here. And in fact, maybe civilizations obey some kind of power law with a few very large civilizations, but lots of very small ones. We saw that Toynbee, in his first 12-volume work, identified 29 civilizations, but when he came back to it later in his 1-volume book, his count had increased to 37. So the more he looked, the more civilizations he found. And what's more, he increased his number of categories. So he started with proper civilizations and abortive civilizations. But then when he looked again, he found that there was this other category of of what he calls satellite or arrested civilizations. So the more he looked, firstly he found that there were more civilizations, and secondly he found that there's more kind of subtlety to what really counted as a civilization, and particularly because some of his list of civilizations in his second work, he puts question marks by, so they're kind of questionable. So there's a kind of merging, blending at the edges, what really counts as a civilization. And so it may be that, in fact, new cultural movements are coming into existence all the time. And some of them last for hundreds of years and then come to be called civilizations, whereas others maybe die out after a few decades or a few years, and so they're not really noticed, but they're the same basic phenomenon. They're new cultural areas, and so there may be this power law where we've got very large ones that are being called civilizations, but other similar movements that we don't call civilizations, but are basically the same thing, and there are lots of them. So, but we could potentially call them civilizations, but they're kind of mini civilizations. But they are new super styles, new ideologies, new mental outlooks, and new styles of art, new styles of cooking, new styles of dress, new styles of architecture. These come into existence, but they don't last long enough to be, honoured with the term civilization. So maybe civilizations, though, do exist on all temporal and spatial scales. So from the very short-lived to the very long-lived, and the very local to the very, regional, or stretching over vast parts of Eurasia. But there is this sort of continuity, this spectrum of cultural movements from civilizations down to, little art movements or something, or new subcultures like, say, the Goth subculture in the West.